you doing, guys? Today I am back on my 1955 Wheel Horse Senior. Specifically, I'd like to get the gear cases back together. But prior to actually diving right into the gear cases, one of the things I need to do is I need to bolt the frame back to the rear axle housing. Now, there are 3 bolts. You can see them right here, 1, 2, and 3, that coincide with 1, 2, and 3 in the side plate of the rear. Now, all those bolts are buried, those 3 bolts are buried behind the gear case cover. So we have to put the frame onto the rear, bolt that all together, and then we can start the process of putting the gear cases back together. Now, I am going to make sure everything's good and squeaky clean on the plate, because I am going to put a little bit of Permatex sealer around the bolts. So that way we can keep the, I know there's like fairly thick oil, gear oil that goes into these gear cases, and we'll talk about that at a later date once we get there. But in general, I don't want the bolts to weep, because the nuts actually are on this side. You can see where the frame witness mark is. But so let's get this thing pulled out. Let's get some jack stands. Let's get the bolts. Let's get the sealer. And we're going to get into it. I got the frame temporarily mocked up to the rear. For hardware to bolt the frame back to the rear end, I'm going to use these grade 8 cap bolts. I believe they're 1 inch in length. I am going to use these 3/8/16 nuts that are 11/16 socket size. So the original bolts to an early Wheel Horse RJ35 and to the Senior is that style. It's 3/8/16 thread, but takes 11/16 socket instead of the more modern or standard 9/16 outside. So with that, we've got a couple of washers I'm just going to throw in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clean these all up, make sure there's no oil on them. I'm going to use a little bit of Durco sealer around the heads to seal it up so the gear lube doesn't leak out. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the nuts, and then I'll just torque them in. I don't know. I'll figure out what I want to torque them to once I get it all back together. I set the bolts to 30 foot-pounds. That's what it said on my chart for a grade 5 bolt. I know I use grade 8 bolts, but the nuts are grade 5, so I didn't want to blow all the threads out. I do have blue Loctite on each one of the bolts, and I have the Durco sealer sealing up the bolt heads. Now I'll let that sealer cure and overnight, and then tomorrow I'll take a razor blade and just cut the excess off. That's what I did when I put the rear end together. So it should look nice and clean, even though it'll be on the inside. All right, next up, let's pull all the gear case parts out, and let's see what we need to do to get that back together. With the sealer cured, I'm just going to take a razor blade, go around the bolts, clean off all the excess, as well as just hit it with a wire brush, a little tiny wire brush to clean them up. And this is the outcome. Nice and clean, sealed. There's none of the little, there's really very little chance that there's going to be a little flake of sealer that might break off, get caught up in the oil and all that stuff. So that's the finished product once they're all trimmed back and clean. So I'm going to go ahead, trim back this, clean these bolts up, and we'll get some gear case parts out. All right, I got some parts out. Basically, I have, if you're sitting on the tractor, the left side. These are all the parts for the left side gear case. All the big parts have been cleaned. I did that a while ago, so all that needs is a blow off of air, some light brake cleaner, and then just going to be greasing and oil everything up. I do have a couple grease seals that I have to install, and we'll get to that in a minute. I got, in a prior video, if you take a look at my playlist under the senior portion, I showed you how I machined these replacement gears to fit. I'm going to go ahead and knock the keys down, cut those down, get those to fit in real good, and then I'm going to install the 1/4 20 set screws with a little bit of blue Loctite, so that way we can get that in. Next, I will pull out the bearing, which is a rat chair, clean it, lubricate it, install it in the holder right there, push that in there or press that in, and then I'll get then there's a big huge gear with the axle end that sticks off. So I'm gonna get all that set up, and then we'll talk about what's next. Gears are installed. We got the keys cut to size. They fit real nice. I have the set screws in, blue Loctite to lock them down. I also took a 6/1000 feeler gauge and slid it behind the gear and the housing, so that way there's no play in the axle, so that way there's absolutely no chance for it to bind up or rub or anything like that. Did the same exact thing here. Cut the key down, installed the set screws, some blue Loctite, set it to 6/1000 clearance, so that's all good. So those are in place. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to swap the gears, the big drive gears for the axles. And what I mean by that is this is the left side gear. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the right side and take the right side gear and put it on the left. And I'll tell you why right now. When this gear is spinning in this direction, it's driving the tractor forward. And you can see that the teeth on this side are a little bit worn. They got some beat up marks on it and stuff like that. Natural for a cast gear of this age. But when we go on this side of the gear, the teeth aren't nearly as worn. They're like more polished. And that would be because this would rotate in this direction or traveling the tractor in reverse. So to make sure that we have as good of a tooth going forward, I will take this axle and put it on this side. So that way, when it's driving in this direction, this gear will be pushing on the good sides of the teeth. So I'm just going to go ahead and swap that. So I got to go over to my parts section over there where all my senior parts are. And I'm going to get the other axle. I'm going to go ahead, blow this out, make sure it's good and clean, fill it up with some assembly lube, install this. Then I'm going to go ahead and I have the gear case cover outside. I'm going to go clean that all up. We're going to start gooing it up, putting the bolts in, and we're going to get this all together. Can't believe we're actually going to have the two gear cases back installed. And there they are. Both gear cases are installed. I will say this one here on this side, the left side, when you're sitting on the tractor, I probably could have put a little bit more sealer on this one. It shouldn't weep. I don't believe it will, but I did this one first, and then I did this one second, and after I got done torquing this one all in place, I said, I probably should have put a little bit more on there. So on this side, I got I went the other extreme, got a little heavy-handed, but just like the banjo rear end and those bolts inside the gear cases, once I get the sealer cured overnight, I'll just go around with a razor blade and clean it right up, and you won't even know that there's sealer there. The bolts, all 10 bolts, 5/16, were torqued to 20 foot-pounds, and as you can see, in a big crisscross pattern, so that way it sucked it right in. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull out all the brake stuff, because we've got to put the backing plates in next. I do have some seals to install, and there's a bearing to install. So we will get on to that right now. Oh, the other thing too is I got to run over to my buddy's shop. I'm going to see if I can get the tires mounted. And that way I can maybe, once I get this all together, get it sitting on its tires. But that's for a little bit later date. Maybe I'll do that tomorrow. But right now, brakes. Next up, we need to make a gasket for the backing plate. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if that's original to a Senior, but my Senior had a gasket between the gear case cover and the backing plate. So I'm going to go ahead and make 2 new gaskets, one for each side, just like it was when I tore it apart. Now, one thing I just showed, I trimmed away all of the excess sealer. You can see it right there on the floor. I think that gives a nice, clean, and sanitary look. So there you go. So both gear case covers just look awesome. I'm really happy with the way that turned out. So let me go ahead. Let's make a template of that gasket that was on the workbench here. We'll make a template, and then we'll cut it out of some gasket material. With a leather punch, 1/2-inch leather punch, I went ahead, used the gasket to see where my holes needed to be. I punched the holes out with the leather punch, and then I just made obviously I circled the inside of the gasket and just cut that out with a razor knife. Now, one of the things that you want to do, or one of the things you want to make sure, is when you make a template like this, you want to make sure that the manila card will sit nice and flat on the surface, and that way you know that the bolts are not pinching the paper. So when you cut it out of the gasket, there'll be like either too much material between the bolts or too little, for that matter. Overall, this looks like it sits pretty dang flat. Yeah, it fits flat enough on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trace the backside of the gear case cover, so that way I can just trim it out with either the razor knife or with a pair of scissors, and then I'll cut it out of the material. So here's my gaskets. They're all made, ready to go. But just before we can reinstall the backing plate, there is a grease seal or an oil seal that has to be pressed into the back of my backing plate. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You've seen me put in, it's just a standard grease seal. You've seen me do that 100 times. I'm going to go ahead and put that in, press it in, not a big deal. And then I'm going to put a little bit, well, there's a couple pits right here, and there's a couple pits on the other side. Right over here, I think it's up on the top. Yeah, right here on the top section. I am going to clean this up, and I'm just going to put a little touch of sealer right there. I mean, like just where the pits are. And then I'm going to go ahead and bolt the backing plates back on. The seal is installed, and what I installed was a CR seal on part number 11170. That was the seal that was in my particular backing plate. Now the backing plate goes in this position. the brake actuator needs to point forward to the front of the tractor. So this will go on like that, okay, and the adjuster is at the bottom. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to spin this real gently, I'm hoping. There we go. And I'm going to put a piece of masking tape over the top. Now, I filed these edges to make sure they're nice and smooth so they won't cut the seal. But I'm going to put a piece of masking tape over it so that way when I slide the backing plate into place, there's no chance of me cutting the seal. Now, one thing you might notice is that the seal is got the seal pointing up and not back down. And the reason for that is there's gear oil on this side of the seal, and then there's bearing grease that runs on the big roller bearing, which we'll get to. Maybe in this video, it might be the next one. But there's a big roller bearing that goes on there. That's all greased. So basically, I want to keep the gear oil from migrating into the brake area, because basically it would drip all over. It would migrate down. If I had the seal the other direction, the gear oil could migrate out the axle shaft and then all over the brake shoes. So with that, that's the reason why it's installed in that direction. I'm going to put a piece of masking tape, like I said, and then I'll lubricate this a little bit with some grease and then use my gasket and bolt it all together. And there it is. The gear drive, or the rear gear drive of my Senior, is back together. It looks clean. Everything looks great. It fit together super nice. You could just barely make out the gaskets down there, but everything looks really good. Everything lined up and went right back together. You can see that's what I meant by the tape. I forgot to take it off, but just put a piece of tape over the sharp edges of the key just in case so you don't nick the seal, and everything is back together. All right, and when we grab the pinion and we turn the pinion, so I'm turning the pinion here, you can see everything moves real nice. So I am super stoked about that. Everything seems to spin real nice and smooth. Everything went back together. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. I'm kind of tired. I've been working real hard, right? Next up, we're going to do the brakes, and I'm going to mount the tires. And we might even start putting the front end on, so that way we can get this thing possibly as a roller. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're interested in the rebuilding or the reassembly of a 1955 Wheel Horse Senior, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we will see you on the next video. Have a great day.